Square Enix's answer to Bungie's Destiny, Gearbox's Borderlands, and Ubisoft's The Division was, well, another looter shooter. Outriders released in April 2021 to what can only be described as muted fanfare. The majority of what was included, from the story to the abilities and character kits, were fine, but the launch state was technically inferior and undercut a lot of what was interesting about the game. These were fixed with time, and the free New Horizon update, launched late last year, gave the community that was still playing an extra dose of content, and some significant tweaks to the endgame. Looking back, what I liked most about Outriders was the abilities and gear given to you. The weapons and loot are excellent, particularly aesthetically, and their function as stat-giving, death-spewing entities via the mod system was also something I really liked. Yet there were some obvious design mistakes. Class balancing, low legendary drop rates, and a real lackluster endgame were all major issues that put a lot of people off. Enter Worldslayer, Outriders' first paid DLC. This was released for all platforms the base game is available on the 30th of June, and provided an entirely new story and endgame to the base Outriders experience. It says a lot about how I felt about the original Outriders, and how barren games for late June, early July in 2022 is, that I did pre-order this. Having now finished all the Worldslayer content, I have mixed feelings about that decision. I started Worldslayer with my Devastator, a powerful close-range fighter who wields Earth-aspected abilities. The game gives you the option to roll a max-level character if you don't already have one, so if you're looking to pick this up and join a friend who's already there, they're not going to be sat waiting for you to catch up. The story picks up with your Outrider learning that the anomaly is growing and getting worse. This is causing a host of natural disasters around the planet of Enoch and threatening life as you know it. Fairly standard for a game of this type. You go in search of a scientist who might be able to help, and meet this game's antagonist, the Commander. She's a powerful altered who has unique abilities and has presumably been leading the insurgent faction in the shadows since the start of the original game. Her introduction is well done. She comes across as calculating, intelligent, and strong. She's a perfect villain. It's a shame that 2.5 hours later, when you put her down for good, that it feels like this ending was lacking. It's not that all the pieces aren't there just to make this great. There's a strong villain to overcome, a justifiable reason to wipe her out, and hordes of her strongest minions to crush. I just don't think there was enough time here to build her into a great villain. As I noted, it took me a little over 2 hours to finish Worldslayer's story content, and I wasn't exactly aiming for a speedrun. Throughout that time, the Commander is only a bit part player, and I feel that it's difficult to build up any character in that amount of time, never mind one who's supposed to play a major role. This expansion story is middling at best, but I do suspect that most people didn't pick this up for the short burst of narrative. This expansion is lacking in this type of content, presumably because a lot of development time was put towards the new endgame activity. This is teased towards the latter part of the story, and then around half an hour later, you're stood at the endgame waiting to start acquiring loot. Before I touch on this, I do want to discuss the new progression systems that were introduced with Worldslayer. There's a new skill system. These involves the PAX skill tree. This is an additional tree that you unlock points for via Worldslayer story progression, and this augments your existing build with additional effects. The second is the Ascension system, which functions very similarly to Diablo's Paragon level and Borderlands' Badass rank. These are small buffs to your character, like increased anomaly damage or firepower. These start as low as 0.5% and can be built up into sizable buffs as you put more points in them. These feel more like balancing improvements than actual improvements to the game. This kind of feels like it's what is needed to give your characters some natural survivability or damage that was missing in the base game. Even wearing exactly the same gear as I had previously, my character was now exponentially more powerful as a result of these additions. But this feels like what should have been there at the original endgame, not what I should be getting halfway through a DLC. Also new for Worldslayer is Apocalypse tiers, which mostly replace the Expedition tiers and the world level that the game had originally. You level this up in the same way you would a character, and each rank up increases your drop rate as well as your chance of getting Apocalypse gear. And this does nicely lead us on to the endgame. While you can see Apocalypse gear drop during the Worldslayer story, you're not likely to see a lot of it until you start running Terraria Gratar, the game's new endgame dungeon. This is a multi-staged area that doesn't quite replace Expeditions, but is a more sophisticated and better designed area than the individual Expeditions were. Essentially, Terraria Gratar is an enclosed labyrinth with branching paths and boss encounters. Each room has a different kind of encounter, but don't be lulled into thinking these are procedurally generated or like some roguelite story minigame. The environment here is fixed, and most of the same rooms you visit on your first run will be identical on your second, third, fourth, fifth, etc, etc. For me, who began their first foray into this area on Apocalypse 16, I already had a pretty good drop rate for legendaries. By the time I'd explored every room, I'd seen at least 10 drop during my run, including a new shotgun that was perfect for my character. This drop rate improvement over Expeditions is important, and you need to start acquiring Apocalypse gear and Apocalypse versions of your legendary items quite quickly. These are fundamentally the same as their base legendaries and epics, but with a third mod slot. Given how powerful some of the mods are within Outriders, I can't understate the power you can gain by getting 1, 2, or even a full set of these. This third mod slot only exists on Apocalypse gear, and it seems to be designated to a random effect. This could be a random tier 3 mod or a random tier 1 mod, so each time that item drops in the world, you have a chance of that third mod slot being something incredibly helpful, or something that doesn't quite fit with your build, and this is helped by the new endgame area being longer and dropping more items than an expedition. While Apocalypse gear feels like a strong addition overall, Terraria Guitar isn't the silver bullet this game's endgame needed. It's just too similar on each run. Rather than being this unique twisting labyrinth that changes every time you enter, it's essentially a corridor of strung together mini expeditions. The solo experience here is quite rough too, similar to the final Eye of the Storm expedition. Some of these fights mechanically are designed for 2 or more players, such as having 2 areas that need to be stood in to activate a thing or to weaken the boss so you can damage them. Conversely, I regularly found my character to be surrounded by enemies and unable to move or roll, so I'd just power on through them. The sheer number of enemies that you are left to fight here, it almost felt like at times I was a runaway driver and the police were boxing me in on all sides to slow me down. In these events you have no choice but to hope that your gear and health regen outlasts their health pool so you can blast your way through. One final progression mechanic is the Apocalypse tiers themselves. These started at 16 when I loaded into Outriders, and there appears to be up to 40 of them. Having played more than a handful of successful runs of Terraria Guitar, during which time I hit every optional room, I managed to make it to Apocalypse 20 for a grand total of 4 Apocalypse levels gained. This already feels like a slog, and not one I'm particularly interested in hammering away at because I'm pretty much clearing these without a problem as is. I shouldn't be having this kind of success rate if it was leveling me up this slowly. I'd have expected the game to try and push me further up the Apocalypse tiers the more I was blasting through without any resistance. As I draw this review to a close, I feel I should touch on a few issues with Outriders that still seem to be present from the base game that have crept in here too. The most noticeable for me is that the cutscenes seem to feel stunted. Models do occasionally jitter on screen during these, despite the game holding at a rock-solid 80 FPS in combat. Each cutscene seems to cut off a little too early too. I start to see the fade-out animation about 2 or 3 seconds before it feels like it should. Something about the cinematography just feels off in this game. Maybe it needed a second QA pass. I noted above that the expansion's villain didn't get much screen time to develop, but that also holds true with your existing companions. Aside from Shira, there's absolutely no real story arc for any of these characters, nor side quests in which there's extra dialogue for them. Again, this is mostly because of how short the narrative is, and there's a tiny bit of extra once you do clear this endgame activity, but even this ends on an infuriating cliffhanger. I'm of the opinion that nothing hurts Outriders more than its endgame. While this has been improved here in Worldslayer, this still feels like what the base game should have been. Worldslayer itself feels like it could have been a good £15 DLC, but for £30 plus, this is a hard pill to swallow. When this is packaged with the original game at a later date and you can get the whole experience for around £40, I would certainly recommend it. But right now, it's still missing something to justify that value. Instead of this being the start of a resurgence from Outriders, instead, this feels like entering a holding pattern. This is exactly the same quality as the base game, and such is functional but not spectacular. I'd certainly be interested in hearing about and playing an Outriders 2, as I like a lot that is here, but this DLC has me convinced that tagging more content onto what is the base experience is not a solution for what ails it. As such, Outriders remains on a list of middling looter shooters, and while the abilities and aesthetics are cool, I still believe it lacks the potential for longevity that it needs to thrive in a very saturated market.